Welcome back to Season 3 of Multifamily Unpacked. I'm your host, Tyler Christiansen. In today's episode, we unpack the multifamily landscape with Scott Berka, the Senior Managing Director of Brand and Customer Experience at Greystar, the largest property manager in the world. Scott's responsibilities at Greystar are wide-ranging, so we took on a bunch of different topics. But in particular, we unpacked his title of Brand and Customer Experience. Scott shared that from his perspective as a consultant, we leave so much opportunity on the floor as it relates to brand. And then we unpacked where we're going in the future with loyalty, rewards, and overall elevating the customer experience. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us on Multifamily Unpacked. We are thrilled to have you. You and I have had conversations like this over the last several years, and I'm grateful you're willing to join us as a guest and share your insights with our audience. And so to that end, if you could share a little bit about your unique perspective, what brought you to Greystar, and what is it that you do over there on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tyler. It's good to be here. So just for the benefit of the audience, I lead strategy and innovation for Greystar's property management business. That includes branding and digital experience, among a few other things. And I've been here about 5 years, and it's really topics I've been involved in my whole career. It's my core passion as a career and what I've done my whole life. And it just so happens that this is my first time able to do it in this industry. So have always really been excited about that. And it's the reason I joined Greystar in the first place, was to think about how can we improve and build upon the experience that we have for our renters.
Yeah, and today, I think all of us have been amazed at when we say renters and owning strategy and innovation for any company is an exciting endeavor. But I want to maybe touch on the scope of what that means at Greystar, because we are talking about, I think the latest NMHC list, which doesn't even include the Wood acquisition or strategic merger, but was something over 800,000 units. And that's just domestically. So, I mean, we're talking about 1 million plus renters, right? And I'm curious, given your background in the consulting world, as you mentioned, you've worked in strategy, worked in innovation, brand development. What was it about this unique opportunity? Because I do think all of us who come into multifamily fall in love with it. But I'm sure, like you, often when you explain it to people, it's almost as if they don't know that that's a a vertical that one could pursue a career in. So, even when you joined, Greystar was not the million plus residents that it is today. So take us back in time to when you first had that opportunity presented to you, and kind of how you think about or thought about the scope of the opportunity to bring your skill set into the world of multifamily.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, Greystar is my first foray into the multifamily or real estate sector generally. My first career was in advertising. So I was an ad agency guy and working for big and small agencies doing interesting ad campaigns or what have you. And then I found my way into McKinsey doing strategy consulting. And a lot of the work I did there was very similar to what I do at Greystar, just for other industries, a lot of financial services and retail. And I loved that work. I really liked helping a company understand what value can you add to the consumer, to the customer, right? And in what ways can we change that experience or change the marketing or change the product to make that better? And that's something I did for decades in different careers. The problem with it was that I would work on something that I got so passionate about and then ultimately have to hand that off and leave it. And I was like, well, I really liked what I was doing there. And that was just the nature of it. So I wanted to find somewhere where I could do that permanently. So I was looking around for places to do that, and I just stumbled my way into this industry. I wasn't specifically looking for it. And what I found interesting about this industry is the opportunity was so big in the topics that we're talking about. It's like, man, this is the biggest industry that really no one else has ever heard of in some ways. So
Yes.
that was interesting. And the other thing about it is other companies, and I worked a lot with banks and wealth management companies and credit cards and retailers, they would kill to have the number of touch points that we have every day with our customers. They're like, oh, how do I figure out when someone's moving? Because that's such a big, important point. I'm like, man, we just have that data. We have so many ways to interact with our customers, and there's so much more we could do with that.
Yeah. This is really interesting, and I knew about your McKinsey background, but I think I had missed the ad agency guy. So I want to kind of unpack that data point with what you just said. I heard a great podcast this week from my entrepreneurial icon hero, Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, biggest prop tech company in the world. You know, he's a designer, and he was talking about that in their world, you only really use Airbnb twice a year. And so they were thinking about, advertising in terms of the top of mind awareness is very important, right? And I agree with you. What's interesting about multifamily, you and I have both built a lot of digital experiences now for our multifamily customers, is that at the end of the day, this is where they live. And every single month, they are paying rent, submitting a work order, renewing, leasing, communicating with the property staff. It is a high touch industry. And I think thinking about that career trajectory where you were ad agency influencing decisions, the consulting world of really creating strategies, but maybe not to your point, able to see them through, in perpetuity. And now we're really on the operator side here, leaning in with the team at Greystar. I'm curious if there are, you talked about some of those lessons, in the insights, but that trajectory to me feels almost natural. So while you stumbled perhaps into real estate, I'm curious if there's been any big just observations as you've taken more and more ownership of that. I'm going to influence, I'm going to strategize, and now I'm actually going to help execute on that strategy. Am I thinking about that in the right way?
Oh yeah, for sure. As I think with anyone's career, I imagine you would say the same thing about your career trajectory too. It's like it is a great story you can tell after the fact, but it felt a little bit more random at the time. So
Yeah, I'm
I'm
glad I
not going
can
to say
narrate that. That was beautiful. You planned it perfectly, Scott. Yeah,
no,
me
yeah.
too.
From birth, I was like, no, here's exactly every step I'm going to take, and I just followed that plan. That's how life works, right? It was just like that. So, but yeah, I mean, thematically, it has been very consistent. I mean, since my earliest days in the career, it was like, oh, I love thinking about and getting my head wrapped around what does the customer care about, and that started with marketing and ad agencies, and then it went into the strategy, and now the running of it. What's been interesting for me is with those different vantage points at every step, you have a different perception of what the biggest challenge is. Or, oh, well, if I just did that part, it's easy. You just do that. You just do that thing different. As the advertiser, you're like, well, yeah, just like if you just change the product a little bit, it's easy. Like the marketing is that part will just handle itself if you could just make these couple tweaks. Or, as a consultant, you're like, well, the strategy is straightforward. Just do it. Like, why wouldn't you just do it? Now it's like, okay, as living it as an operator, it's like, man, and got a heavy dose of this in consulting too. It's like change is hard.
Right.
And I think you live this a lot at Funnel too, because a lot of your customers, being one of them, I know this. It's like we're embarking together on changing the way that we do business, and even with the best possible tools and the best communications plans and the best intentions, change is hard. Change is
Yeah.
hard at the individual level, and it is even harder at the organizational level. So it's just that understanding what the perception is the hardest part has changed over time. But yeah, it has
Yeah.
been interesting.
I do think you nailed a really important point, which is the entry point at which folks and people who listen to this podcast, Scott, are most of them didn't start their career in multifamily, but they found themselves in it. And when you come into the industry, there's these moments of observation, and then there's the long hard work of making the changes. I know you and I are friends with another podcast guest we've had here several times, Mike Gomes, and he brings a world of experience from his world of Disney and the Atlanta Falcons. But I love how you kind of constructed that concept of seeing the problem is not necessarily the hardest part, right? It is executing the change management in the most conducive and efficient way. And I think that I've been always impressed with the vision that I've heard you articulate and other leaders at Greystar. We have a unique opportunity. And I almost feel that Greystar presents itself as a responsibility. We have a unique responsibility as one of the largest operators in multifamily to drive and steward a better future. I'm curious, as in hindsight, like you said, connecting the dots and looking back, when you joined multifamily, what surprised you most? So coming from that advertising perspective, coming from your consulting perspective, clearly, like you now know, we have tons of opportunity. There's tons of data points. But was there anything that really stood out to you in terms of, I can't believe we market that way. I can't believe we operate that way. So we'll start with that. We'll get to the challenges of changing it later. But what really stood out to you in terms of some of those disparities?
Yeah, one of those I already mentioned, but just to put a finer point on it, the customer opportunity, and when I think about it from a branding or a marketing perspective, it was shocking to me. It's like, hey, this is one of the biggest industries that has no really known brands. You think about it, and to take that even a step further, it's like we have no known brands, and yet we're the most important purchase decision that people make. Period. Yeah, I mean, so many times in my advertising or consulting, people, you talk about third place. I don't know if for audience members there was always the coffee shops wanted to be third place, right? Okay, well, first place is home, second place is work. We need to compete as a bank branch or a coffee shop or whatever. How do we have people come to us more so that we have that engagement? They're like, yeah, we want to be third place. I'm like, I come here and I'm like, we're first place. We don't have to do anything to have more of that exposure to our customers. And we don't, I don't think as well as we could as an industry take advantage of building that relationship with our renters, our residents, our customers. So like that, I mentioned that earlier, but that's one of them. The second thing that surprised me, and I didn't have an expectation, but the way our industry has historically approached technology surprised me. And it's when I joined, like I said, I had no like preconceived notions of, well, what are the tools and the technologies that we use to serve customers? And I was surprised to find out that really nothing is done in-house as a management company. It's like this industry has a few specific vendors that we use, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But it's exclusively a vendor strategy. And I found that to be interesting. When you think about other industries, it's usually a mix, but here it really wasn't that way at all. And just was kind of an surprising. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it was different than what I had experienced elsewhere.
Yeah, no, that is a really good observation, and I think we're gonna come back to that, differentiating the brand experience and brand awareness. But the idea that we don't have the ability to kind of use technology ourselves, I think, probably goes in line with how much the industry has isolated itself. Right, to your point, a lot of people don't even know it's there. I often describe multifamily as the Reno, Nevada, right, the littlest big city in the world. It's a big industry, but it feels very little. And because of that, sometimes we over nuance and kind of, well, I could never possibly use a tool like Twilio when it's an API, right? And so I think that the advent of more modern API type technologies, we're excited as hopefully a more modern technology stack to partner with folks like yourself and others who are, leveraging new BI tools, leveraging new data tools, consumer insights, and the world of marketing, as we're talking about, is rapidly changing. The world of fintech is rapidly changing. So while I think I could probably write a pretty good thesis on why we got here, I do think, to your point, it's a really fun opportunity to embrace that hybrid strategy. And so to maybe turn that, we talked a little about kind of how you got to multifamily.
Am I allowed to interject and ask you a question here, Tyler? Is that a thing your guests have done?
Oh, no, let's do it though. I would love to.
I would be interested in your answer to the same question. You've spent a lot of, obviously, in technology, but like, what surprised you most? You said you fell in love to this industry. What was surprising to you at the time?
Yeah, wow, really good question. And I would say at the time, I'm a late bloomer, Scott. I would not have been hired by McKinsey, and so my observations were not particularly astute at the moment. But I think as I've been on my entrepreneurial journey, there's a book that's sitting right behind me here. It says 0 to 1, and I love this book. It's about how to build startups, or frankly, how to change the world. It's written by Peter Thiel, and in it says you have to believe in secrets if you're going to change the world. And these are things in plain sight that you just have to kind of embrace and get moving from 0 to 1. And there are things that over the last decade, I mean, obviously the most notable one with Funnel is we believed centralization made sense for everybody. Obviously, it does look different for a REIT than it would for a third-party manager, but I think over time that's bearing out that a shared services model benefits everyone, the consumer included. One that you just touched on, and I have for a very long time not understood, is why we don't have brands. That's always shocked me, that we as an American society embrace brands, but in multifamily, we haven't. And what I love though about these secrets is you kind of have to ask, why don't we, right? And there's one argument, which is no one's big enough to have a single brand. Well, now Greystar's, getting there. But the other one that I've heard up until even last week, I was at AIM and I heard, well, we don't want to put our name on the building, because then if the customer's experience is bad, they're going to know who it's bad with, right? And it's going to carry on. And I think that to me, kind of thinking about our next question is we've not really defined a consistent customer service level, right? And therefore we have not wanted to be branded, much like, most collection agencies in the country aren't branded. But I
Right.
think that's always, I thought, surprised me from probably at least 5, 6, 7 years ago, that nobody has ran away with that opportunity.
I would subscribe to both of those theories. I think the fragmentation part was true up until even today, where there's no point in branding something cross property when you don't have that many properties. There's not as much value to it, for either the company or for the consumer. That's decreasingly the case these days as there's more consolidation. But your second point on service standards, yeah, I've heard that one too. Like, well, I don't, which is, you could argue, would then mean that maybe we shouldn't brand some of our telecom companies either, or public utilities, but those all seem to have brands.
Agreed. And it almost, therefore the brands lean, when I fly, don't mean to disparage anybody, but Spirit Airlines on occasion, if I need to, I know what to expect. It is a lower cost provider, but I also come to expect that, it's going to be efficient. I have to pay for my bag. It's going to be cheaper. I think there's a room for various brands. And I think right now we're doing the consumer a disservice by simply not, we don't communicate the level of experience they should expect, because every property is Arbor Green. And so I think there's still opportunity. And let's segue into that. I mean, you do have under your purview today, if anybody were to Google Greystar brands, I counted in preparation for this, there are 18 unique brands. Now, many of them are bespoke. Perhaps it's, senior living or student. Several of them are on a country by country basis, which we should also talk about international. But there are five, if I counted correctly, five conventional US brands. So I'm curious, and you and I have talked before, but we should talk here about LTD. But
Yeah.
what is your perspective today on brands? Why do you have brands at all? And is that something you anticipate growing? Will the number of brands grow, or will we see the existing brands be more widely deployed?
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of the first things that I championed when I joined Greystar, which now is, 4 or 5 years ago. And the development and investment cycle takes a while for those brands to actually make their way through the market. But to answer your question of like, why do we have brands in the first place? It's really simple, and it's two reasons. And it's the reasons everyone in any industry has brands. It's like, number one, it helps consumers understand what they can expect from a product consistently. And part of that service, but in this case, a lot of it's just product, right? Like, okay, what kind of apartment building are we talking about? What kind of amenities? What kind of finishes, units? When you see a Birchway by Greystar, you kind of know that that's going to be roughly the same. Or if you're in LTD, since you mentioned it, like, yeah, that's going to be very consistent if you're in Pittsburgh or Orlando or Houston. And then the other reason is, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this in a little bit, we want to build a direct relationship between Greystar and our renters. And that's something that we have not really endeavored to do up to this point. But with the scale that you mentioned, it is increasingly one of our priorities and vision to have Greystar really be that global brand of choice among renters. And that's going to take a lot of work. And branding is part of that, right? To have a global network, people need to know your network exists, which if you don't put your name on stuff, they don't.
Well said. Yeah. And I want to go backwards then. The opportunity you are putting in place the building blocks, as I would perceive it. And to your point, it takes some time. You have to establish these brands. You have to establish the consumer experience. I will say, knowing you're an ad agency guy, maybe this makes sense. I actually, just even hearing the names when I was going through the website, the branding is really crisp, because when I hear LTD versus Birchway, if I'm not mistaken,
Yep.
it does even connote a different level of experience. The LTD communicates a consistent, but perhaps even minimalist type experience that it is not, it's high quality product, but it's not going to have, all the amenities, perhaps not going to be staffed with all the concierge staff. So when you think about customer service versus customer experience, and in particular in a world in which you are trying to drive towards a direct relationship with a consumer and expectations of customer service levels, how do you distinguish between those two? Because today I think broadly speaking, most folks would say we're not the best at customer service in multifamily, but there's been a lot of talk about a new customer experience, and in part of that digitization and kind of the tools that are available. So, would you agree with me that perhaps customer service and customer experience are not one and the same? And how do we get to a world where there is more consistency there?
I definitely would agree with you. I do not believe they're one and the same. I believe customer service is a subset of customer experience. And this is semantics, and I don't know if this is a textbook definition, but for me, customer service means, oh, someone has proactively sought the company out. And the question is, well, how do we serve them as someone who's reached out to us proactively in that
Right,
specific moment?
right.
Great. That's important. I'm not saying that's not important. Customer experience is the collection of every touch point that we have with our customers. That could be them reaching out, that could be them digitally shopping for a property, that could be them applying without actually speaking to another human being, that could be the lease, that could be, it's literally the collection of every touch point we have, not just in person, but also digital touch points. And the collection of how those things come together to really it comes down to like how does someone feel at the end of that interaction. Well, you don't, yes, we measure that with customer satisfaction or NPS or whatever, but it's like, well, did you feel good or did you not feel good after the sum of those interactions? That to
Yeah.
me is customer experience.
That was well well worded. I'm glad this is being recorded, and I completely agree. This feeling you walk away from the brand has so much to do with that, and that's why I again have been so shocked, because the reason I stay at certain hotels or travel with certain airlines is I want to have a consistent experience. I want to walk away not feeling frustrated, or that I was, didn't get the value I was looking for. And I'm curious, Scott, as you look at the wide mandate that you have, again, there's so much in you just said there are a million different touch points you could pick up on, especially in a world like yours where you have senior, student, conventional, international. What are the biggest challenges facing us today on the customer experience side, right? If we combine all of those into an overall feeling, what are the biggest challenges that you faced over the last several years as we look to improve that? Because, like, I mean, going back to what you said earlier, we all say, well, just fix it, right? Why can't it be great to be an apartment renter? What is there one or two things that really have stood out to you that you look and say, this has been probably the hardest part in this change, as you alluded to earlier?
Yeah, my answer may vary. I'll bet if we asked our friend Mike Gomes, which I'm sure you did ask him this question, he may have a different one. And I say that
Yeah.
not because of Mike or Cortland specifically, because I think that they're great. It's just the structure of various companies in this industry have inherently different challenges. My direct answer to your question, what's the biggest challenge from my perspective in improving this? It's fragmentation. The way that we run, and maybe this is a Greystar unique issue, but when I think about the third party management business or the owned management business, we're inconsistent with the tools that we use and even some of the processes. I mean, there's certainly a lot of consistencies, right? We have standard procedures and all of that stuff, but it compared to other industries, and I think hospitality or really any service industry that has known consumer brands, there is a much higher level of consistency in terms of the tools, the technology, and the training that get used, which define that experience. Because if you want that experience to be the same for someone, whether they're in LA or New York, whether they're on an app or a website or talking to someone in person, you have to have the tools that deliver that experience. And you have to have the training for the people that are supporting those tools, for the people on site or the people off site. And we are just scratching the surface of being able to get that more consistent. And that's, like I said, that's not going to be true for every company in our space. Some have a lot more consistency, but I mean, ultimately it goes back to the point I made earlier. We're changing behavior. We're changing behavior of our team members, and we're changing behavior even of the residents, training them how they should expect to get service and how they should interact in the most effective way.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the fragmentation point that you make, and this has been one of as I unpack the secret of why have we not delivered a better branded, convenient, consistent experience. Fragmentation there's two challenges. There's the world that third party managers live in which you have myriad stakeholders and technology tools, and you've grown through these iterations. And then the the owner operator over the last 10 to 15 years in particular, Don Beveridge has written a lot about this. They've become fragmented in that, 20 years ago, equity residential was close to 200,000 units. It's about as big as we got. And there was a thought that perhaps there was going to be a world in which there were REITs that had 1 million units. We've gone the other way. Today, the largest REIT in the country is MAA, and they have consistency in certain markets and they have density in certain markets, but it is a single digit percentage of residents at those communities who will move to another one of those communities, right? So I think that there are a small handful of third-party managers who now have the scale at which to avoid fragmentation of availability, but then have the challenge of fragmentation of clients. And then the other thing that I've discovered as I've been studying, why don't we have brands in multifamily, is the hospitality model has another layer that we don't have today, which is that the brand is a separate concept from the management company, right? So if you were to go ask, when you're checking into your next hotel, there's an asset manager who owns it. We have those. There's a property manager who manages it. But then they pay for the technology, the brand, and the playbook that is, a Renaissance versus a Ritz-Carlton. There's nuance in those, and they have interoperating systems, so it's a consistent consumer experience. But I couldn't agree more that the fragmentation is not going to be solved quickly. So as much as I'm ambitious about where we're going, and I guess to that point now, let's flip the question on its head. Where are you most excited to make progress? And it could be on the more challenging things, but you've got a lot of different initiatives that are kind of under your purview at Greystar. Are there one or two that you look at and say either, hey, we've made a ton of progress and I'm so proud of where we're at, or I think that we've got a plan now so that we can progress and really drive us towards that better customer experience?
There's so many things, Tyler, that I'm excited about. I'm going to go back to one I said earlier, and it's like a collection of a whole bunch of stuff. So we can unpack this or not, depending on where you want to go with it. But it's like the thing that I am most excited about is building a brand that is known and sought after by renters. And that brand is Greystar. That is, and that has a lot of components to it. That's not just branding, right? Branding is it's the tail of the dog. It's not the core substance, right? To build that brand, that goes to the service experience, right? That we've been talking about. Like, how do we set and deliver and communicate what service people can expect when they're at a Greystar property? Second is we need, I think, to add more benefits to what it is that we offer. Everyone's got a lease. That's fine. I think there's a lot more benefits that we can be adding, whether that's rewards or loyalty, or services. Like, what benefits can we offer to our residents beyond just, yeah, great, you've got 4 walls for 12 months. I mean, that's good, but I think we could do better. And then lastly, how do we connect all of that together into a network? And part of that has to do with knowing that it's Greystar and what does that stand for? But how do we make it easy to move between properties? And we have a lot of student properties, and those students graduate.
Right.
And they hopefully get jobs and they move. And they moved somewhere. Maybe it's the same market, maybe it's a different one, but they're definitely leaving that student community. How do we make it easy for them to come and stay in the Greystar network, right? And underpinning all of that is the technology, and that's the data, and it's the digital tools that let our customers do all the things I just said. So I know it's a lot.
Yeah.
That's the thing I'm most excited about.
So the only question I want to ask, unpack that, and then we're going to come back later. I want to use LTD perhaps as an example of where you're doing this in the real world. I have heard you and others within Greystar speak to 2 massive transformations that you are willing into existence. And the one that we've kind of touched more on, if I'm listening, would probably sound more like a B2C transformation. But what you've also been saying, the subtext here is there's a B2B transformation. At the same time, while we are making our brand aware to the consumer, we as a business have to transform the way in which we operate with our clients and the way that the tooling, the systems, the data, the visibility. And so I guess, yeah, is that the right way to frame it, that both these transitions, if we're going to deliver this, this large initiative to have a consistent known resident, and the resident knows you, and there's a lifetime value is what I heard you say, Scott, that in my software brain, it's not just a lease value, but a lifetime value that Greystar or others who would hope to achieve this can't just throw a logo on a building. They have to change the whole kind of business structure to deliver that. Is that fair?
I think generally that's fair. Certainly it's fair to say there's a lot of operational or kind of current state changes that are underpinning this. I definitely would say that's fair.
Yeah.
And some of those I think we would be doing anyway.
Right.
Like even without trying to build a more consumer facing brand, it's like, well, how do we operate more efficiently? How do we raise service levels in doing so? How do we add more benefits to our current residents? I think those are things we would probably be doing anyway.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with how do we think about the way we run properties differently? And that's obviously the theme in the industry generally, and funnels very, very near and dear to your heart. I know that as well, but it's that's something that has been, I think, overdue. And there's just benefits of whether you want to call it centralization or standardization or specialization, whatever fancy buzzword you want to go with. Like thinking of operating properties as individual entities is like, there are reasons why economies of scale as a concept exist. And it's like, oh, by pooling some of those roles, you get benefits from it. So that's stuff that we would be doing either way.
Yeah.
But pulling it all together and how do we talk to our customers directly, maybe some of the incremental benefits and things like loyalty, those I think we're really only doing because we want to be this global brand of choice.
Yeah. And I do think that you're right, perhaps are independent paths that perhaps converge in the future in a better state. In particular, when I think about cross-property renewals, to me, an offsite shared services team is best set up for that. And so again, I want to double click onto LTD. Maybe it's because I've visited the one here in Champions Gate near Orlando. Anybody who's driven between Tampa and Orlando, you'll see this beautiful community and right by the Omni Hotel. But tell me about LTD, because there's a lot of deserving focus in our industry on affordability. And I mean affordability with the lowercase a. And when you think about the LTD brand, and anybody who hasn't checked it out, please just go check out LTD by Greystar. I love that there's a brand promise. And I'm curious kind of what was the genesis of that? And is it something you expect to see, grow, or is it more of a bespoke part of the portfolio?
And I'm glad I love talking about this topic. So we could spend a couple hours on this. I don't know how long we got on this podcast. So let me talk a little bit about what it is, and then I'll answer some of your specific questions. So one of the things at Greystar that we want to address is the lack of housing, right? The housing crisis. And I think as an industry, we know that really well. There are, I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like 4 million too few homes just in this country. And that number is not going to catch up anytime soon. If you look at just the rate of new housing built, it's nowhere near what it needs to be. The other problem is most of the new housing is at a pretty high price, right? It's at rents or at purchase prices that usually are not middle of the market. So what happens is median income folks, people that really are the majority of our country, you think teachers, you think firefighters, you think nurses, like that, those types of jobs, you really have a hard time affording quality housing without maybe different government programs. So like that's the challenge. And I will not personally take credit for this, although if I'm involved, like, Bob Faith, our CEO, this is something he's personally very passionate about. Is like, our belief is that there has to be a market-based solution for that. We can't just rely on government programs to solve it. 4 million is a big number. So there have to be a bunch of ways to do that. So our question was, how can we, with a private market solution, start to solve this, right? It's something that's profitable from a business standpoint. It's something that addresses the consumer need, and it's something that actually addresses the lack of housing. So that was just the challenge in front of us. And LTD is the brand, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff behind that. So to address that, there were 3 big things that we did. Number one, the way we design those properties is much more, I guess, efficient and optimized. They're very standardized. Like, okay, here's what you get. There's only a couple floor plans. It's funny, you go to a lot of apartments these days, and they're like, well, we've got 42 floor plans. It's like, okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe there's a good reason for that, but it makes the cost a lot harder to control. The more you can standardize, the more cost you can take out. The second thing we're doing is the way we construct those properties. So we actually have a factory that's in Pennsylvania, where for some of the LTDs, although not the first 2, we are building them via modular factory. So the mods, as we call them, they get built in a factory and then we ship them on truck beds and you stack them like, I'm not technical, so no one quote me on this, but it's like Legos, I'm pretty sure, where you stack them right on top of each other. And that makes it go way faster and it's more efficient. And then the third thing is the brand itself and the way that we operate those properties. And one of the things that is unique about our LTD properties is we have made a commitment to anyone who lives in those properties of total rent transparency. So if you sign a lease at an LTD property, we are going to tell you at the beginning-ish of every year what your rent increase is for the entirety of that year, regardless of when your renewal comes up. And that number is going to be either 3% or inflation, whatever's higher. So like, that's it. And like, we tell everyone that's what it is. And you know, and that's going to be true for as long as you keep your lease in that property. So like that's what, it's really a whole bunch of stuff. And LTD is the brand that we have used. As you said, it kind of alludes to limited. So it's limited service. And there are ways that we have changed the way we run it to make it have a rent that is really attainable by the vast majority of Americans. So that's what that is.
Yeah, man, I get, and like, I really do love the concept of we don't have enough brands in multifamily. And so I love that. But the focus on affordability, I think everyone knows Greystar is the largest manager in the country. I think less people know you're also the largest developer in the country,
Yeah.
as validated by NMHC top 50 list. And if you add the wood numbers, it's not even close. And so I think those of us who love this industry understand it begins and ends with supply. That is,
Yep.
and I couldn't agree more with what you and Bob communicated, which is that we can't rely solely on capital A affordability programs. We, as an industry, and this is true for Funnel, we have a program that we know is not going to solve housing affordability, but it is our way. We call it home. It's our way to model helping with more housing opportunity in this country. And so, yeah, and one thing I think is really neat about this is you mentioned, it is a profitable, capitalist minded way to do this, but address the housing supply, because we all know that self-service is a more efficient way to deliver the customer experience. And so I think right now there is a real tension in our industry of, is the property being understaffed as a cost-cutting measure? And I think what the LTD brand gives an opportunity is that if we build from the beginning in the literal structure of the building and the technology and the lease process, perhaps we can build a better self-service model that is much more capital efficient, right, to operate, than trying to reverse engineer that. But yeah, I like that I don't have to go to my bank and I don't have to talk to somebody. I prefer an automated experience. But sometimes, if I'm at Home Depot, I might want someone to talk to. So anyway, I love that element of the LTD brand, that the efficiency is both a clearly, let's be efficient, run this profitably, but also puts a real emphasis on self-serve automation for the customer.
And you touched on like a couple things that I'll just piggyback on. So we had to start with a totally blank slate here, because the idea of retrofitting or figuring out how to do something like, oh, we have these properties. So we just started totally from scratch. So our first two of those, one is in Orlando, as you mentioned, there's another one in Houston. And they were like, we just clean slated those, totally ground up. Like, what should the floor plan look like? What should the build out look like? What should the amenities look like? How should we run it? How many people on site? How should we communicate that? So like that was a necessary approach, because trying to do it piecemeal, I don't think would have gotten us to the same outcome. And the second thing is, it really is, this is a point about customer experience. It's all about expectations. So, if you walk into whatever it is, let's say you're going to the doctor and you show up and they're like, hey, look, we're sorry. We know you have an appointment, but we're like 30 minutes behind schedule. And you're like, oh, kills me. I have an appointment for a reason. Like, I don't think you understand what appointments are for, but whatever. And then, 30 minutes goes by and they're like, sorry, it's another 15 minutes. And they're like, come on. You leave that experience and finally you get seen and whatever. That's an unpleasant experience. I think everyone would agree with that. Take the same exact situation and say, okay, you're an hour before your appointment, you get a text message and says, hey, Tyler, look, we're really sorry, but we're actually about 45 minutes behind schedule. So if you want, you can come over maybe 30 minutes later than usual, or you're certainly welcome to come and we'll try to get you in as early as possible. And you're like, wow, that is not great because I had this appointment, but maybe you can go 30 minutes later, you show up and you get another message, or you show up and they say, hey, we're right at 45 minutes late, so we're going to be with you exactly as we said. Again, sorry about the delay. Same thing, you go in. Somehow it's the same outcome. You're still 45 minutes late to see your doctor, but you feel a lot better about it. And
What
it's just one example of like setting expectations are everything. And to connect that back to LTD, we made it really clear for people as they moved in of like, here's how you engage with this property and with the staff. And it's a little bit different maybe than how you've engaged with other properties. Like we're not gonna, don't come to the office because there may not be someone at the office. Here's the way that you should do that. So expectations are everything, and setting them right at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and I think in particular, when you were talking about the renewal process, Scott, that's where my head was going. That I went out and did these interviews with renters last year when we fundraised, and I'm excited to do another round of those. And, the renewal process in particular is so painful for a renter. And a lot of people may be thinking right now, well, right now, renewals aren't going up 20% like they were. I think Greystar and everyone else is aware that's a temporary situation because the lack of starts that's happening in our industry right now, the supply demand imbalance you talked about, we're about 4 million houses short. And so renewal increases are going to be coming back, and for good reason, because the supply demand balance is not there. And so the ability, if I, as a consumer, to know ahead of time my renewal rate, it's either going to be inflation or 3%. That is huge. And talk about meeting expectations, right? I mean, I think that's a beautiful, beautiful point for folks to understand about consumer experience, whether it's your move-in experience or it's
Mm-hmm.
the renewals. Try and get ahead of that. And I do want to maybe just use that as a segue. So I know you touched on centralization in this world. So if we're looking into the future and in this world with LTD where, hey, we're setting the expectation with you that if you want to talk about, a service issue that you're having, there may not be someone here at the leasing office to come speak to about it. How are we thinking about centralization in that world? Is it a specialized offsite team? Is it self-serve digital tools that we expect them to interact with? I'm guessing maybe all of the above, but what does the word centralization mean? And let's just keep it maybe in the context of what you just described with LTD.
Yeah. Yeah. All of the above is the short answer. It's funny. And I'm guilty of this. Using the word centralization, I think I've grown to dislike that exact term per se. The concept I like, great, but I think it's more about specialization
Right.
is where I've evolved to. And it's like, hey, if it's for the shopping process, if I'm someone who's looking to find a new place to live and maybe I'm looking at LTD, there's no reason why that conversation interaction has to be with someone who's physically on site. There isn't. And frankly, the biggest thing that we find in our research about what people care about during the shopping experience is responsiveness. And if you have someone on site who's trying to help a prospect, they're probably also dealing with 15 other things at that same moment. So as it turns out, they're not as responsive as someone who doesn't have to deal with all that stuff. So if you have someone who's offsite, yeah, they may not know exactly every nuance of that property quite as well as someone who's physically there, but with training, they can get pretty close and they can be very responsive. So, that's one way, and true for LTD. It's true for many of our properties now that are utilizing what I'll describe as an offsite leasing team, that's responsive and helps answer questions and helps schedule tours and helps follow up from tours. It's all of that. It's easy to do for functions that you don't physically need to be there. With maintenance, the phrase I always like to use is like, well, someone has to turn the wrench. Like
Yes.
you can't do that fully remotely. So it's maybe less about doing it fully offsite and more about how do you group properties together. And it's not a new concept in our industry, but you do it in like pods, where you have a maintenance team that's overseeing multiple properties together. And again, same thing that we're doing with LTD. So it's a mix of things. And then the digital tools would be the last part. It's like, hey, how do you have people, instead of training people, hey, come to the front desk, hey, go to the app, go to the website. You're going to get a faster answer there anyway. And it's weird because this is the one industry where somehow that's like we're behind the curve on that.
Yeah.
Every other thing that we as human beings do is like on our phone first. So we just it's always odd to me that we haven't quite caught up with every other industry.
I think it goes to what you said before. It's about the expectation setting. And it's, I mean, even back to your ad agency days, we have almost marketed that touch as a value, but we know we're all consumers at the end of the day. And, I'm not sure if anybody's watched a movie from the 80s recently, but, airline customer service used to be waiting in line to talk to the person at the ticket desk. Right. And it's classic. You can think of any 80s movie. There's these terrible scenes of talking to the ticket agent. It was awful. It was an awful experience. Right. And then we retrained ourselves that you called in and waited an hour. And then we've been retrained over and over, where now 90% of us, it's digital. I would rather use the app to rebook my flight than have to call and wait 10 minutes or get a call back. So there is I think, going to your point earlier, it's why it will take time, but every operator listening to this needs to be thinking about, how can I start resetting expectations now at the individual community level, that we're seeing a shift, but our goal is not to decrease your customer experience. Right. And so I couldn't agree more that there is a process to achieve these things.
The other thing I'll just note here, a lot of times people get a look of panic when you say centralization, depending on who you're talking or who I'm talking to. I won't project on you.
No, we see it too.
Like,
We see it.
whoa, wait, what do you mean? What's happening to our jobs? And it's like, well, actually, that's not necessarily what this means, right? In a lot of cases, this means taking some of the functionality of stuff that's being performed on site and letting people that aren't on site do that, so that the people on site can focus on the customer experience. What's the point of being on site if you're going to sit there and do your accounts receivable and your reporting all day? Like, what? You
Well
do
said.
that anywhere. You
Do it
might
from
as well
home.
instead yeah, exactly. Instead, why don't you engage with the residents and the prospects, and like use the time for something that is uniquely on site, as opposed to doing it on stuff that, well, you could kind of do that from anywhere. And frankly, you'd be more efficient because you wouldn't be interrupted 15 times.
Well said. Yeah, and I think that we're seeing that slow transition. Another transition that's been happening, and I know that the Greystar team has been looking at this from different ways, and you alluded to it earlier, introductions of loyalty concepts. So we've talked about brands, but brands, as you said, is kind of the tail, not the dog. Loyalty as a concept of extending value with the resident is one concept, as are rewards. And you specifically earlier said rewards and loyalty, and I caught that, because to me, I think they are different concepts. But will we see more loyalty programs in multifamily in the future? More akin, and would they be more akin to what we see in hospitality?
I think, well, with the bar being 0, it's hard to say no to that.
Touche.
Yeah, I think we will see more. Certainly on the reward side. I know you're asking about loyalty, so I'll come to that in a second, but it's just a way to differentiate and add more value to residents, whether it's one property or 1,000. It's like, well, how can we make this experience great, so that come renewal time, someone is excited to renew for whatever rate that ends up being, and that they're going to recommend that property to their friends, and you're going to have more traffic, and that's going to cost you less in marketing, right? So like, having more benefits and a better value proposition to residents through rewards is a no-brainer. Loyalty requires you to have something to be loyal to. So there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation here. That's probably not even a good analogy. You have to have a brand or something that you're offering loyalty to. And like, one program that I think a lot of people will be familiar with these days is Built, which is getting into the rewards and loyalty space. And they've done a great job with coming up with partnerships and having as points currency and having these benefits. So that's the only one, I think, in our current industry that is even in the ballpark of loyalty. But I think there's a lot. We're in the very early innings, right? This is like, this is the first time we're stepping into it. I expect we will have more coming about. I don't think we'll ever get to a place where, there's tons of loyalty programs, just because we are not going to have tons of brands that are big enough to be loyal to.
Yeah. And I want to, in the interest of time, I've got two just burning questions for me. The first is, given what we've discussed and given your unique vantage point working with myriad clients, will brand lead to a world where lease lengths change? Because I've said this before, but being the son of an asset manager, he hates the concept of short-term stays and even long-term stays. He says, I invest in multifamily because the 12-month lease is magical. It's just long enough to avoid the kind of volatility you see in hospitality, but it's short enough to catch the upside, unlike office. So are we going to ever see lease length change, or is the 12-month going to be the norm for the next 10, 15 years?
I don't see a reason why it's going to change, honestly. Even today, it's not like it's just, 12 months or walk. In most places, it's like, oh, well, it's actually a sliding scale. Maybe it's 11 or it's 10 or it's 8 or it's 15. And that with each of those, maybe there's a different rate associated with that longer or shorter term. So there's already, I think, more flexibility than
Right.
the adage that you just described. That obviously I'm not,
No,
that
I hear
wasn't
you.
what you meant, but yeah, I don't see it needing to change. I do see the need for short term. It's funny, short term stay comes up a lot. It's come up a lot with us, actually. And with short term stay, I don't see that as a substitute for longer term. Anytime you're talking less than a few months, that to me, it's not a substitute for someone's first place. That's like, oh, I want to take a trip where I'm in between stuff. There may be some people that applies to, but I see that as layering on top of a quote long-term lease. Maybe there are some longer term options, but generally speaking, I think renters on the consumer side like the flexibility of not being locked in for a long period of time. Life happens, stuff
Right.
changes. It's breaking a lease is pretty painful too. So I think it's equally from a consumer preference standpoint as it is from an asset manager standpoint. I don't know if I would describe it magic, but I kind of like that. That's catchy.
All right. Well, and the last crystal ball question I'll ask you, Scott, is thinking about AI, thinking about data, and you can combine these or separate these, but do you think how we view data in a world in which data can be processed so much more quickly now is going to change? And obviously, you've alluded to that it's been a big part of your job, Greystar, is to try and get a better picture of your renter. When you look out into the future, I know as a technologist, there's way more tools available to me now. Does our industry finally get a better view of data because of the computing power we now have, or how does that impact the way you think about it?
I don't, yes, I think our industry does and has already made big strides with, well, first it's just having the data in a well-structured way. I think historically we've not, and this is true for many industries, but I'm not sure that we have as structured of data as we like. And I'm sure many would agree with that. Whether it's because of AI or not, I think we're just in this landscape where there are more digital interactions with customers through whether it's companies like Funnel or even just traditional management systems. So we have all of this information and now are thinking in a more advanced way of, well, what can we do with that? And how can that help us even without the AI layer, which I'm not even going to try to speculate on what AI can or can't do for us in the future. I, there's a lot of interesting potential out there, but I know it's going to change our business and our world. I just am not even going to attempt to explain how. But on the data side of things, it's helpful for every stakeholder of our business if we are better at having it and using it for that group. So whether it's an asset manager, if we have data that helps them understand asset performance and how to do that better, that's valuable for them. It's for our renter, helping them understand, oh, what are their preferences? How do they want to be communicated with? Do they prefer a text or an email? What unit do they like when they're shopping? What other things do they care about that we should be talking to them about? Right? It's like, it's basic stuff. And you could go down the list of stakeholders for our team members. How do we help our team members be more efficient with their time and not have to deal with tasks that are mundane by prioritizing it more effectively or by automating stuff that, hey, you don't need to do that report. Let's just let you focus on stuff that's actually value add. So, I see that just continuing. That's not a controversial opinion per se, but
Yeah.
I think it's
Well,
where it would go.
knowing the amount of work you've put into to start to have a beautiful picture of your renter, it may not be controversial, but there's a lot of work that others still need to do in our industry to get there. And well, Scott, this has been a ton of fun for me, and clearly we both are passionate about this stuff. We're going to wrap up with just the rapid fire questions here. You seem to be a very intelligent guy and well read, well versed on different subjects. Are there any books or podcasts, whether current or favorites, that you'd recommend to us?
There are two podcasts. I'm a big podcast fan because I always on the move.
Yeah.
The All In podcast, which is an AI tech. It's not. It was pretty
Yeah.
well
I
known,
like
but
I like that. That's on my list.
Interesting perspectives on AI and on technology generally, not specific to our industry. The second is called the Innovation Show, which is reviewing different books and different perspectives and stories on innovation. So it usually gives me a like, oh, that's how this industry approached it. So just good thought-provoking topics.
Love it. Thank you. Those are great. I'm going to add the second one to my list, the innovation show. All right. Is there a cause? Obviously, you're working on housing affordability now, but you and your family, you decided to step away from work. You're going to work on a philanthropic or personal cause. Is there something you're passionate about that you could dedicate that full time to?
It probably it's one of two things. I mean, housing would be on that list regardless, but obviously that's something I get to do full time
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
Energy and the environment, and just generally like sustainability. I think there's just a lot of work we have to do to figure out how do we get to a sustainable place of being globally as a species, as a planet.
Right. Agreed. And I do think, I mean, I know that Greystar's got initiatives there too. So lucky for you, you're working on both of
I
those
get
in
to
your
do
day
both.
job.
Yeah, it's good. And as my wife, who's much more philanthropically, that's her career, she would argue that actually the best place to do that is through corporations because you can have direct impact anyway. So maybe I wouldn't retire and I just keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, that is the dream. Yeah, I'm trying to do the same over here. All right, we've got a billboard outside of my office here in Tampa, Florida. Scott, if I were to give it to you, do you have an opinion, either multifamily, Greystar, or just otherwise, that you'd slap up there on that billboard?
You know, I knew you were going to ask me that question, and I just don't. I don't have one. Can I ask you that question back? Am I allowed to do that?
Let's do it. Yeah. I would put supply equals affordability. That would be mine. That I think
Mhm.
that supply for American housing is the number one thing that red, blue, purple, I think everybody should agree on, and we should just do what we can. Either that or yes in my backyard. I like YIMBY. So, and I,
Big Yimby fan. All right.
yeah,
Yep.
and we happen to be in a rural area here in Tampa. So a lot of folks in the rural areas kind of push back on that. So maybe I do
Yeah.
that. All right. And then last one, this is not meant to be self-serving because although our tagline is renter centric, a lot of what you're working on is just customer centric. So in Greystar's world or in Scott's world, the sentence renter centric, what does that mean to you?
It really, for me, and this is maybe using terms to define it, but I think it's starting with the experience and benefits to the residents and the consumers, and then understanding the implications and how it benefits the properties and the owners. It has to be both, but it's just elevating the consumer to a point where, oh yeah, that's the starting point of the discussion.
Yeah. Well, I loved how you separated earlier when I was trying to B to B and B to C. You highlighted that, hey, we would do this B to B transition anyway. It just so happens it also benefits the renter. So love that. Well, Scott, this has been a ton of fun. Thank you for giving us time to go over these topics. I know that a lot of folks will learn a lot from it. So thank you and have a great weekend.
Happy to be here. Same to you, Tyler.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Take care.